He was the handsome silver-haired man from Ohio who promised America a return to normalcy after the trauma of a world war. Warren G. Harding, the 29th president, was elected in 1920 in a landslide victory, seen as a reassuring symbol of traditional values. Yet within 3 years, he would be dead, and his administration would unravel to become one of the most corrupt in American history. His story is a gripping tale of contradictions, a presidency marked by significant policy achievements like the Washington Naval Conference, yet completely overshadowed by the greed of his cronies in the infamous Teapot Dome scandal. It's a personal tragedy of extramarital affairs, blackmail, and a secret child, all hidden beneath a carefully crafted public image. This is the story of how a man who only wanted to be liked became a cautionary tale, a president whose loyalty to his friends led to his own downfall and left a permanent stain on the office he held. The story of the man who promised America a return to normalcy begins fittingly in the quiet heartland. Born in rural Ohio just after the Civil War, Warren Harding was molded by the classic 19th century values: hard farm labor, a one-room schoolhouse education, and the unyielding belief in self-improvement. But it wasn't the farm that called to him. It was the intoxicating smell of ink and the clatter of the printing press. As a teenage printer's devil at a small-town paper, he discovered his true passion: the power of words to shape a community. That passion wouldn't just define his career, it would eventually propel him to the presidency and ultimately set the stage for his ruin. This upbringing forged the man he would become. He was, to all appearances, the quintessential self-made Midwestern everyman. He was approachable, good-natured, and possessed a natural charm that made people feel instantly at ease. This persona, so deeply rooted in his Ohio upbringing, would later prove to be his greatest political asset, allowing him to be embraced by a nation desperate for a leader who felt familiar and trustworthy amidst the dizzying urban chaos and sweeping progressive reforms that followed World War I. His Ohio roots also connected him, almost by birthright, to the state's powerful Republican political machine, the conservative old guard that prized loyalty and tradition above all else. This network, combined with his own ambition, provided a clear, if gradual, path to power. But the path wasn't entirely straight. After his time at the press, he tried his hand at various pursuits. He attended Ohio Central College in Iberia, graduating in 1882, where he honed his oratorical skills and edited the campus newspaper. He played the cornet, displaying a love for music and camaraderie that would define his social life. After college, he tried teaching in a country school, but found the discipline and monotony ill-suited to his gregarious personality. He studied law for a short time, but found the dry, meticulous nature of the profession uninspiring. He even sold insurance. All these brief forays were part of a young man's search for his place in the world, a search that consistently led him back to his first love, the newspaper business. The defining moment of his early adulthood came in 1884. At the age of 19, going on 20, with a youthful bravado that belied his inexperience, Warren G. Harding purchased a failing local newspaper, the Marion Star. Marion was a larger, more dynamic town than Caledonia, and the Star was on the verge of bankruptcy, a daily paper in a town that could barely support a weekly. It was a monumental gamble. The early days were a desperate struggle for survival. Harding worked relentlessly, often around the clock. He did everything: editor, reporter, typesetter, ad salesman, even the delivery boy. He poured every ounce of his energy and charm into the paper. He understood with an instinct that couldn't be taught what the people of Marion wanted to read. He filled the Star with local news, gossip, and boosterish editorials that championed Marion's growth and prosperity. He avoided divisive national politics, focusing instead on the issues that mattered to his neighbors: the quality of the roads, the success of the local baseball team, the happenings at the town hall. His writing style, which would later be criticized on the national stage as bloviation, was perfectly suited to his audience. It was grand, optimistic, and filled with a comforting homespun wisdom. He wasn't just reporting on the community, he was actively building it, and in doing so he was building his own reputation. The Marion Star became his platform and his identity. It grew from a struggling rag into a prosperous and influential local institution. And as the paper's fortunes rose, so did Warren Harding's. He became one of Marion's most prominent citizens, a respected businessman, a member of all the right clubs and lodges, a man people looked to for leadership. It was this local prominence that inevitably drew him into politics, but it was his personal life that would add a layer of complexity and drama that would follow him all the way to the White House. In Marion, Harding met Florence Kling DeWolf. She was a figure as formidable and unconventional as Harding was affable and easygoing. 5 years his senior, she was the daughter of the town's richest and most powerful man, Amos Kling, a ruthless, domineering banker who was accustomed to getting his way. Florence, however, had inherited her father's iron will. She had defied him once before, eloping at 19 with a man named Henry Pete DeWolf, with whom she had a son. The marriage was a disaster. DeWolf was a spendthrift and an alcoholic who abandoned her and their child within a few years. Florence returned to Marion, a divorcee and a single mother, a status that carried a significant social stigma at the time. She supported herself by giving piano lessons, her pride and determination earning her a reputation as a tough, no-nonsense woman. When the handsome, charming young newspaper editor Warren Harding began to court her, her father was apoplectic. Amos Kling saw Harding as a feckless, ambitionless upstart, completely unworthy of his daughter. He forbade the relationship, threatened to disinherit Florence, and spread vicious rumors about Harding, including a persistent and baseless whisper that the Harding family had mixed-race ancestry, a deeply damaging accusation in 19th century Ohio. But his opposition only strengthened Florence's resolve. She saw in Warren a kindness and a potential that others overlooked. They married on July 8, 1891. Amos Kling did not attend the wedding and refused to speak to his daughter or son-in-law for 7 years. Their marriage was a complex and powerful partnership. Florence, whom Harding affectionately called the Duchess, became the business manager of the Marion Star. She was organized, disciplined, and shrewd, possessing the financial acumen that her husband sometimes lacked. She managed the circulation department, kept the books, and instilled a level of efficiency that was crucial to the paper's success. She was in many ways the driving force behind his ambition. While Warren was the public face of the Star, the charming editor who knew everyone by name, Florence was the steely spine that kept the enterprise running. Their relationship was not without its troubles. Harding's roving eye was a source of constant tension, and they endured periods of significant strain, including a lengthy nervous breakdown suffered by Florence that required extensive medical treatment. Yet, through it all, they remained a formidable team. She was his fiercest defender, his most astute advisor, and the unwavering guardian of his public image. Without the Duchess, it is unlikely that the man from Marion would have ever reached the national stage. His growing influence as a publisher made a transition into politics almost inevitable. He was a natural. His experience as an editor had given him a deep understanding of public opinion, and his years of glad handing and community involvement had built him a loyal network of friends and supporters. He had a magnificent speaking voice, a commanding presence, and an innate ability to connect with an audience. He began his political ascent in 1899 when he was elected to the Ohio State Senate. He quickly became a popular and effective legislator, known for his ability to build consensus and his unwavering loyalty to the Republican Party. He wasn't an intellectual firebrand or a policy wonk. He was a pragmatist, a harmonizer. His legislative philosophy was simple: support business, promote Ohio, and above all, get along with his colleagues. It was during this time that he forged the friendship that would both create and destroy him. He met Harry M. Daugherty, a sharp, cunning political operative who saw the world as a chessboard. Daugherty, a master of the sordid mechanics of power, wasn't looking for a leader, he was looking for a vessel. In the handsome, charismatic, and popular Warren Harding, he found the perfect man to carry his own ambitions to the White House. Harding was the face. Daugherty would be the hidden hand. He attached himself to Harding's rising star, seeing a president long before Harding dared to see one in himself. After 2 successful terms in the state Senate, Harding was elected Lieutenant Governor of Ohio in 1903, serving under Governor Myron T. Herrick. It was a largely ceremonial role, but it raised his profile across the state. In 1910, he made his first run for statewide office, seeking the governorship, but was defeated. It was a setback, but Daugherty was undeterred. He knew that Harding's real strengths lay not in executive leadership, but in the more deliberative, social environment of a legislative body. He urged Harding to set his sights on Washington. In 1914, the opportunity arose. A new constitutional amendment allowed for the direct election of U.S. senators by popular vote for the first time. Daugherty expertly managed Harding's campaign, presenting him as a distinguished, reliable Republican who would represent Ohio's interests with dignity. Harding won the election decisively, and in 1915, he left Marion for the nation's capital. The small-town newspaper editor, the son of a rural Ohio doctor, had arrived on the national stage. The journey that would lead him to the presidency had truly begun, but the very qualities and friendships that had propelled him this far were already setting the stage for a tragedy of historic proportions. When Senator Warren G. Harding of Ohio arrived in Washington, D.C. in 1915, he did not exactly set the city ablaze with legislative fire. The United States Senate was a chamber of powerful egos, brilliant legal minds like Elihu Root, and fiery orators like Robert La Follette. Harding, by his own candid admission, was none of these things, and to his credit he seemed to have very few illusions about his own intellectual prowess. He once famously, and with a characteristic humility that charmed his colleagues, remarked to a journalist, "I am not fit for this office and should never have been here." He was not a man driven by a deep-seated ideology or a burning desire to craft landmark legislation that would reshape the nation. Instead, he approached his senatorial duties much as he had approached his role as the editor of the Marion Star, with a primary focus on building relationships, smoothing over conflicts, and diligently serving the people back home who had elected him. He was, by all accounts, one of the most well-liked and popular men in the Senate. Democrats and Republicans alike found him to be agreeable, handsome, and unfailingly courteous. He had a gift for remembering names and making every person he spoke to feel important. He rarely made enemies, a feat he accomplished largely by avoiding firm, controversial stands on the most divisive issues of the day. His legislative record was, as a result, almost entirely unremarkable. He was a staunchly conservative Republican, a loyal vote for the party leadership on nearly every occasion. He supported high tariffs to protect American industry, stood in opposition to most of President Woodrow Wilson's progressive reforms, and, as the Great War concluded, became a prominent voice among the irreconcilables, the bloc of senators who vehemently opposed the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations, which they viewed as a dangerous entanglement in foreign affairs that would compromise American sovereignty. He was a master of the grand, flowing, yet often vacuous, oratorical style of the era. His speeches, delivered in a rich, sonorous baritone, were filled with all-American platitudes, soaring patriotism, and comforting phrases about hearth and home. They were typically, however, short on substance. A Democratic senator, William G. McAdoo, once acidly described Harding's prose as an army of pompous phrases moving across the landscape in search of an idea. But while his more intellectual colleagues may have privately scoffed, his constituents back in Ohio were delighted. He was a diligent servant of their interests, securing federal funds for local projects, helping veterans navigate the bureaucracy, and meticulously answering their letters. He was their man in Washington, and he played the part to perfection. But the real business of Senator Harding's life didn't happen on the Senate floor. It happened off the books after hours in the smoke-filled rooms of his Washington townhouse. Here, away from the public eye, the bland, agreeable senator transformed. He became the host of the Capitol's most famous poker games, all-male affairs held in his Washington townhouse. The guest list was a who's who of the Capitol's insiders: senators, lobbyists, cabinet officials, and an assortment of his old friends from Ohio who had followed him to Washington. These men, who would soon become infamous as the Ohio Gang, included the ever-present political fixer Harry Daugherty, the charming but reckless Jesse Smith, and a future director of the Veterans Bureau named Charles Forbes. In these informal, smoke-filled gatherings where illegal whiskey flowed freely despite prohibition, political deals were struck, gossip was traded, and bonds of loyalty were forged. It was here, in the easy camaraderie of a poker game, that Harding was most comfortable. He was a man's man, a joiner, a backslapper. He craved friendship and approval, and his inability to see the potential for corruption in the men he called his friends would become his Achilles heel. It was also during his time as a senator that Harding began a relationship that would cast a long, sad shadow over his life and legacy. He met Nan Britton, a young woman from his hometown of Marion. She was more than 30 years his junior and had developed an intense schoolgirl crush on the handsome, charismatic newspaper editor when she was just a teenager. After she graduated, she moved to New York City and in 1917 reconnected with the now Senator Harding. Their affair began in earnest. It was a clandestine relationship conducted in hushed meetings in Senate office buildings and hotel rooms. For Harding, it was likely another dalliance, a consequence of his seemingly insatiable need for female affection and a long-strained marriage to Florence. For Britton, it was the defining romance of her life. In 1919, she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth Ann. Harding never publicly acknowledged the child, and while Nan Britton later claimed he provided secret support, this was only confirmed decades later by DNA evidence. As his first term in the Senate drew to a close, America was in turmoil. The year was 1920, and the nation was still reeling from World War I and a devastating flu pandemic. Idealism had vanished, replaced by bitter disillusionment. Labor strikes, race riots, and a paranoid Red Scare rocked the nation. The economy was failing, and bitter political fights over the League of Nations had paralyzed the government. Amid this landscape of exhaustion and anxiety, America wasn't craving a hero. It was craving peace. and the Republican Party knew this was its golden opportunity to reclaim the White House. The front-runners for the Republican nomination were two powerful, imposing figures who represented the warring factions of the party. General Leonard Wood, a decorated military hero, a former governor of Cuba, and a close friend of the late great Theodore Roosevelt, was the champion of the party's progressive wing. He was backed by big money and a passionate volunteer organization. The other favorite was Frank Loudon, the competent, respected, and deeply experienced governor of Illinois, who was the choice of the party's establishment and business interests. Warren G. Harding was, at best, a distant third, a favorite son of Ohio, with little national recognition and no significant legislative achievements to his name. He was on no one's list of serious contenders. But he had Harry Daugherty. And Harry Daugherty, the shrewd political operator who had been nursing this ambition for a decade, had a plan. Months before the Republican National Convention was set to convene in Chicago, Daugherty sat down with a reporter and made a now legendary prediction. He spoke with the calm assurance of a man who could see the future. He prophesied that the convention would deadlock, that the leading candidates, Wood and Loudon, were so evenly matched and their supporters so intransigent that they would bloody each other and exhaust themselves in endless balloting. And then he said with chilling prescience, about 11 minutes after 2, Friday morning of the convention, when 10 or 20 weary men are sitting around a table, someone will say, "Who will we nominate?" At that decisive time, the friends of Harding will suggest him and can well afford to abide by the result. It was a stunningly accurate forecast of what would come to be known as the most famous, smoke-filled room in American political history. The convention, held in the sweltering, oppressive heat of a Chicago June, proceeded exactly as Daugherty had hoped and planned. The delegates balloted again and again and again. 4 ballots on the first day, and neither Wood nor Loudon could secure the necessary majority. The convention was hopelessly deadlocked. The delegates grew weary, the heat in the Chicago Coliseum became unbearable, and the party bosses, the powerful men who truly ran the show, grew desperate. They needed to break the impasse. During the convention, Republican leaders held late-night meetings at the Blackstone Hotel in Chicago, later mythologized as the famous smoke-filled room. These talks helped break the deadlock and push Harding forward as a compromise candidate. Over glasses of whiskey and through a thick haze of cigar smoke, they deliberated the fate of their party and the nation. The group included formidable figures like Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, the party's intellectual leader, and Senator Reed Smoot of Utah, a powerful Mormon apostle. They knew they needed a compromise candidate, someone inoffensive, someone reliable, someone who would be loyal to the party and wouldn't rock the boat with radical ideas. They needed, in short, a man they could trust to restore a conservative pro-business agenda and, perhaps most importantly, a man they could control. One by one, they ruled out the leading contenders. Wood was too militaristic and independent. Loudon's campaign had been tainted by rumors of financial improprieties. Finally, just as Daugherty had predicted in the dead of night, their attention turned to the amiable, handsome, and consistently loyal senator from Ohio. He was everyone's second choice, which, in a deadlocked convention, made him the perfect candidate. They summoned Harding, who was waiting anxiously in another room in the hotel, to the suite. According to the now iconic story, Colonel George Harvey, a powerful and cynical editor, looked Harding squarely in the eye and asked him a blunt, deeply serious question. "We think you may be nominated tomorrow. Before we proceed, we would like to know, is there anything in your past life that might be brought up to embarrass the party The room fell silent. For Warren Harding, this was the moment of truth. He was a man now burdened by the heavy secrets of multiple extramarital affairs, a long-term liaison with the wife of his best friend, and a secret illegitimate daughter. An honest answer would have ended his political career on the spot. He asked the senators for a few minutes alone to consider the question. He paced the adjoining room for 10 agonizing minutes, wrestling with his conscience, his ambition, and his fear of exposure. He returned to the smoke-filled room, looked the powerful men in the eye, and, in a moment of profound and fateful dishonesty that would have catastrophic consequences for his presidency and his legacy, he told them that there was no impediment to his candidacy. With that assurance, the deal was struck. The party bosses had their man. The next day, on the 10th ballot, the exhausted delegates, following the whispered instructions of their leaders, began to shift their votes. The stampede was on. Warren G. Harding, the man nobody expected, the quintessential dark horse, became the Republican nominee for President of the United States. Warren Harding's nomination was a political miracle born of backroom deals, but his campaign was a masterpiece of public relations that perfectly captured the spirit of the age. While his Democratic opponent, Ohio Governor James M. Cox, along with his energetic young running mate, Franklin D. Roosevelt, crisscrossed the country delivering thousands of speeches in a grueling defense of Woodrow Wilson's legacy, Harding stayed home. His front porch campaign was a masterstroke of political theater. It transformed Marion, Ohio, into the symbolic heart of the nation. The image presented to the American people was one of calm, dignified statesmanship. Here was a man not frantically seeking power, but waiting calmly for the people to bestow it upon him. He was the steady hand, the comforting presence, the father figure a troubled nation craved. The campaign was a finely tuned machine. Albert Lasker, the advertising guru, blanketed the country with an idealized image of Harding. Newsreels in every movie palace showed him as a benevolent sage, chatting with farmers, greeting veterans, and playing with his beloved Airedale Terrier, Laddie Boy, who became one of the first presidential pets to receive wide media attention and achieve celebrity status. Florence, the Duchess, was the operation's formidable chief of staff. She managed his schedule, vetted his visitors, and carefully guarded his image, often standing just inside the front door, ready to intervene if a reporter's question was too pointed or if her husband's affable nature led him to speak too candidly. She knew his weaknesses better than anyone, and she was determined to protect him from them. His speeches from that porch were exercises in soothing rhetoric. He spoke of restoration, serenity, and of course, normalcy. He offered simple, comforting solutions to complex problems. We must have a sane, steady, and deliberate advancement, he would say in his deep, reassuring voice. He promised an end to the wobbling of the Wilson years and a focus on America first. This message, vague though it was, resonated deeply with a populace exhausted by war, pandemic, and economic strife. They weren't just voting for a man, they were voting for an idea, a feeling, a desperate hope for a return to a simpler time. But behind this carefully constructed facade of Midwestern virtue, two dangerous scandals were festering that threatened to derail the entire campaign. The first and most immediate threat came from Carrie Phillips, Harding's longtime mistress. Bitter and feeling abandoned, she held a trove of his passionate, handwritten love letters, and she made it clear she was prepared to use them. The threat of blackmail sent shock waves through the Republican National Committee. The thought of a presidential candidate's torrid love letters being published on the eve of an election was a potential catastrophe. The party's top operatives moved quickly and secretly. They dispatched an agent to Marion to negotiate. The deal they struck was extraordinary. Republican operatives quietly arranged financial support and paid for Phillips and her husband to travel abroad, effectively sidelining the threat of exposure until after the election. It was a sordid deal, a cover-up that demonstrated the lengths to which the party would go to protect its candidate, and it was a dark omen of the moral compromises to come. The second threat was uglier and tapped into the deep-seated racism of the era. A disgraced college professor from Ohio named William Estabrook Chancellor resurrected the old baseless rumor that Amos Kling had once spread out of spite, that the Harding family had African-American ancestry. Chancellor, driven by a bizarre personal vendetta, began publishing and distributing pamphlets and leaflets filled with fabricated genealogies and pseudo-scientific proof of Harding's supposed mixed blood. The story was entirely false, but in the America of 1920, even the suggestion was political dynamite. Republican operatives scrambled to suppress the story, destroying pamphlets, buying up Chancellor's books, and intimidating printers. It was a dirty, whispering campaign that, while ultimately unsuccessful in derailing his election, revealed the vicious undercurrents of American politics. Neither scandal broke through to the wider public. On November 2, 1920, his 55th birthday, Warren G. Harding was elected President of the United States in one of the most overwhelming landslides in the nation's history. It was the first presidential election in which women had the right to vote nationwide, and they, along with millions of men, flocked to the handsome, reassuring candidate. He captured 60.3% of the popular vote, one of the largest margins up to that time, though later elections produced even bigger landslides. The American people had spoken decisively. They wanted normalcy, and they believed Warren Harding would deliver it. On March 4, 1921, Warren G. Harding was sworn in as the 29th President of the United States. In a subtle but significant break with tradition, he and the frail outgoing President Wilson rode to and from the Capitol in an automobile, not a horse-drawn carriage, a symbol of a nation moving decisively into the modern age. His inaugural address was a perfect distillation of his campaign promises. It was a call for peace, a plea for disarmament, and a promise of less government in business and more business in government. Our supreme task, he declared, is the resumption of our onward normal way. The nation breathed a collective sigh of relief. The era of crusades was over. The era of normalcy had begun. To his credit, Harding's initial goal was to create a government of national unity and competence. He sought to fill his cabinet not just with loyalists, but with the best minds the country had to offer. And in many respects, he succeeded brilliantly. He made the distinguished and universally respected Charles Evans Hughes his Secretary of State. He appointed the brilliant industrialist Herbert Hoover as Secretary of Commerce. And as Secretary of the Treasury, he chose Andrew Mellon, one of the wealthiest men in the world. These were men of immense talent and integrity. But Harding's fatal flaw, his unshakable loyalty to his old friends, the men with whom he played poker and shared a drink, led him to make a series of catastrophic appointments that would ultimately define and destroy his presidency. He couldn't say no to his pals, and so alongside the best minds, he brought the Ohio gang into the heart of the government. He made his political mentor and fixer, Harry Daugherty, the Attorney General, the nation's top law enforcement officer, and he gave the lucrative post of Secretary of the Interior to his friend from the Senate, the charismatic but deeply unscrupulous Albert B. Fall of New Mexico. It was a cabinet of jarring contradictions, a mix of brilliance and corruption that was destined for disaster. In the early days of his administration, the brilliant side of the cabinet held sway, and Harding presided over a series of significant achievements. Under the guidance of Andrew Mellon, taxes were slashed, a move that helped fuel the booming Roaring Twenties economy. The administration passed the first federal budgeting law in American history, the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921, which created the Bureau of the Budget and brought a new level of fiscal discipline to the federal government. He backed the Federal Highway Act of 1921, which provided federal funds to help states build a national network of modern roads for the age of the automobile. His greatest triumph, however, came in the realm of foreign policy. Fulfilling his promise to pursue peace, he convened the Washington Naval Conference in late 1921. At the conference's opening session, Secretary of State Hughes delivered a bombshell. He proposed a battleship holiday and called for the major naval powers, the United States, Great Britain, Japan, France, and Italy, to scrap dozens of existing and planned warships. The proposal was audacious, stunning the assembled diplomats into silence. But it worked. The resulting treaties established limits on naval armaments, preventing a costly and dangerous naval arms race that many feared was leading the world toward another war. It was a monumental achievement in arms control, and for a moment, Harding was hailed as a global peacemaker. In another surprising and often overlooked act of political courage, Harding confronted the nation's most toxic issue, race. In October 1921, he traveled to Birmingham, Alabama, a bastion of segregation and white supremacy. Speaking to a large, segregated audience, he delivered a speech that was nothing short of revolutionary for its time and place. He openly condemned lynching and, in carefully chosen words, spoke of eventual political and economic equality for African Americans. He said, "Let the black man vote when he is fit to vote, and prohibit the white man from voting when he is unfit to vote," framing equality in terms of education and civic readiness rather than immediate universal suffrage. The white side of the audience sat in stunned, stony silence. It was a brave and principled stand, one that few presidents before or since had been willing to take so directly in the heart of the South. It revealed a side of Harding, a genuine decency and a belief in fairness, that history has too often forgotten. But while the best minds were busy with the noble work of governing, the Ohio gang was busy enriching itself. A culture of corruption began to permeate the administration, emanating from a notorious little greenhouse on K Street. This was the unofficial headquarters of the Ohio gang, a place run by Jess Smith, Attorney General Daugherty's closest associate. Here, in a haze of cigar smoke and bootleg liquor, political favors were sold, pardons were peddled, and illegal liquor licenses were granted to the highest bidder. The Justice Department under Daugherty became a haven for influence peddling and graft. The rot was most blatant at the newly created Veterans Bureau. Harding had appointed his charming poker buddy, Colonel Charles R. Forbes, to run the agency, entrusting him with a budget of $500 million, a colossal sum, to build hospitals and provide care for the hundreds of thousands of veterans wounded in the Great War. Forbes proceeded to loot the Bureau with breathtaking audacity. He sold off vast quantities of surplus hospital supplies, everything from bed sheets to medical alcohol, for pennies on the dollar to crony businessmen, who then sold them back to the government at a massive profit. He took enormous kickbacks on fraudulent hospital construction contracts. In total, he and his collaborators stole or wasted an estimated $200 million, a staggering betrayal of the nation's wounded heroes. By late 1922, rumors of the massive fraud reached Harding, Initially, he refused to believe them, unable to fathom that his friend Charlie could be a thief. But the evidence became undeniable. In January 1923, Harding was visited by the General Counsel of the Veterans Bureau, who laid out the damning proof. The president was heartbroken and enraged. According to eyewitness accounts, he summoned Forbes to the White House for a private meeting. The details of that meeting are lost to history, but one account describes the president, normally so calm and genial, exploding in fury. According to one account, he angrily confronted Forbes, with some reports claiming he even grabbed him by the throat. Yet even in his rage, Harding's weakness prevailed. Instead of having Forbes arrested, he allowed his old friend to flee to Europe and quietly resign. It was an act of personal loyalty that amounted to a dereliction of public duty. The worst, however, was yet to come. The scandal that would become synonymous with his administration was quietly taking shape under the watch of his other poker buddy, Interior Secretary Albert B. Fall. The scandal centered on 3 strategic naval oil reserves, one in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and 2 in Elk Hills, California. These oil fields were public lands, set aside by previous administrations to provide an emergency fuel supply for the U.S. Navy in case of war. In 1921, Albert Fall approached the president with a simple request: sign an executive order transferring control of the naval oil reserves to his Interior Department, all in the name of efficiency. It was presented as a minor bureaucratic shuffle. For Harding, a man who viewed loyalty as the highest virtue and suspicion as a personal failing, the signature was automatic. He trusted Fall completely. He signed it without a second thought, let alone a single question. With the oil fields now under his control, Fall moved quickly. Without any competitive bidding, he secretly leased the entire Teapot Dome Reserve to Mammoth Oil, a company run by his friend oil tycoon Harry F. Sinclair. He then leased the Elk Hills reserves to another oil man, Edward L. Doheny. In exchange for these incredibly lucrative deals, Fall received a fortune in bribes. Doheny sent his son to Fall's office with a little black bag containing $100,000 in cash. Sinclair was even more generous, providing Fall with cash, bonds, and even livestock. Benefits later estimated at hundreds of thousands of dollars for his ranch in New Mexico. Fall, who had been on the verge of bankruptcy, suddenly began to live like a king, lavishly expanding his ranch and paying off old debts. The sheer audacity of the scheme was its temporary shield. But a few dogged senators, led by the tenacious Thomas Walsh of Montana, began to notice the scent of corruption. They launched an investigation that would slowly, painstakingly unravel the entire conspiracy. The full sordid story of Teapot Dome would not become public until after Harding's death. But by the spring of 1923, the whispers of scandal were growing into a deafening roar. Jess Smith, fearing his own imminent indictment, died by suicide. The little greenhouse on K Street was shut down. The walls were closing in. The presidency was no longer a prize. It was a prison. Harding, a man who thrived on friendship, was now haunted by it. The White House, once a symbol of his success, became a gilded cage where he paced the floors night after night. Aides would whisper about the president's changed demeanor. The easy, famous smile was gone, replaced by a permanent, weary frown. He wasn't just losing weight. He looked physically smaller, as if the very spirit that defined him was being crushed under the unbearable weight of betrayal. It was in one of these dark, sleepless moments, his face etched with agony, that he confessed to editor William Allen White the words that would become his political epitaph. "My God, this is a hell of a job. I have no trouble with my enemies. But my damn friends, my goddamn friends, they're the ones that keep me walking the floor nights." He was a president trapped in a nightmare of his own making, a good man who had been undone by his own kindness and his fatal inability to judge the character of those closest to him. Seeking an escape from the closing walls of Washington and hoping to reconnect with the American people, he planned a grand cross-country tour, a voyage of understanding that would take him all the way to the territory of Alaska. It was meant to be a journey of political rejuvenation, but it would become his final, fateful odyssey. In the summer of 1923, President Warren G. Harding was a man desperately seeking an escape. The walls of Washington were closing in, the air thick with whispers of corruption and betrayal. His health was failing, and the profound weight of his friend's treachery seemed to have crushed his spirit. In a last grand attempt to outrun the burgeoning scandals and reconnect with the American people whose affection he so deeply craved, he embarked on an ambitious journey he called the Voyage of Understanding. It was to be a grueling 15,000-mile odyssey by train and ship across the western United States and up to the remote territory of Alaska, the first ever visit by a sitting American president. It was billed as a journey of political rejuvenation, a chance for the president to promote his policies and bask in the warmth of public approval, far from the toxic intrigues of the capital. In reality, it would become his final fateful odyssey. The presidential train, the Superb, departed from Washington's Union Station on June 20th. The itinerary was punishing. Over the next several weeks, Harding delivered dozens of speeches in cities across the American heartland in the West: St. Louis, Kansas City, Denver, Salt Lake City. He was greeted by large, enthusiastic crowds, and for a time it seemed the magic of the 1920 campaign might be rekindled. But those traveling with him could see the immense strain. The president looked tired, gaunt, and much older than his 57 years. His speeches, normally so fluid and reassuring, became rambling and sometimes incoherent. He was promoting a complex and controversial new policy: American participation in the World Court, an international judicial body, and the effort of explaining it to skeptical isolationist audiences seemed to drain him completely. He was a man going through the motions, his famous smile looking more like a grimace, while his mind was clearly elsewhere, consumed by the worries he had left behind in Washington. The centerpiece of the trip was the voyage to Alaska. The presidential party boarded the naval transport USS Henderson in Tacoma, Washington, and steamed north. For a time, the majestic scenery of the Alaskan wilderness seemed to revive Harding's spirits. He marveled at the glaciers, tried his hand at fishing, and, in a moment of historic significance, drove the Golden Spike to complete the Alaska Railroad near Nenana. He posed for photos, smiled for the cameras, and spoke eloquently of Alaska's bright future as a potential state. But even here in this remote and beautiful landscape, the shadows of Washington reached him. While in Alaska, he received a long coded message from the Capitol. The contents of that message have never been made public, but it is widely believed to have contained devastating new revelations about the Teapot Dome scandal and the extent of Albert Fall's corruption. Eyewitnesses, including his wife Florence and Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover, who was on the trip, described a visible and dramatic change in the president after he deciphered the message. He seemed to shrink, to be utterly defeated. The last vestiges of his famous optimism appeared to evaporate, replaced by a deep and profound despair. The journey south from Alaska aboard the Henderson was marked by a sudden and dramatic turn in the president's health. He fell violently ill. The official diagnosis from his personal physician, Dr. Charles Sawyer, an old homeopathic doctor from Marion, and another crony appointment with questionable credentials, was ptomaine poisoning, likely from some tainted crab meat served on the ship. Harding was suffering from severe cramps, fever, and respiratory distress. By the time the ship docked in Seattle on July 27th, he was a deeply sick man. Despite his condition, he insisted on delivering his scheduled speech. He spoke to a crowd of 25,000 at the University of Washington Stadium, but his voice was weak and his speech was confused. It was the last public address he would ever give. That night he collapsed on the train as it sped south toward San Francisco. The voyage of understanding was over. The desperate flight from his problems had failed. His body was now in open rebellion. When the presidential train arrived in San Francisco, Harding was carried on a stretcher to the opulent presidential suite, room 8064, at the Palace Hotel. A team of the city's best doctors was summoned to his bedside, and the diagnosis quickly shifted. While Dr. Sawyer stubbornly clung to his food poisoning theory, the other physicians recognized the signs of a far more serious condition, a major cardiac event, complicated by the development of pneumonia. For a few days, the nation held its breath. The press corps set up a frantic, round-the-clock vigil in the hotel lobby. Bulletins on the president's health were issued hourly. Under the care of the new doctors and the watchful eye of Florence, Harding's condition seemed to stabilize. The pneumonia appeared to be receding, and his heart seemed to be responding to treatment. A wave of cautious optimism swept the country. It appeared the president might just pull through. The evening of August 2nd, 1923, was quiet in the presidential suite. Harding was propped up in bed, seemingly relaxed and in good spirits. His wife Florence sat beside him, reading aloud from a recent, highly flattering profile of him in the Saturday Evening Post. The article, written by Samuel G. Blythe, was titled "A Calm View of a Calm Man." As Florence read a particularly complimentary passage, the president murmured, "That's good. Go on, read some more." Those would be his last words. A moment later, as Florence continued to read, a violent shudder ran through his body. He convulsed and then collapsed back against the pillows. He was gone. The immediate cause of death was officially reported as apoplexy, a then common term for a massive stroke or cerebral hemorrhage. Dr. Sawyer and the other physicians signed the death certificate. But in the chaotic hours that followed, Florence Harding made a decision that would forever cloud her husband's death in suspicion and fuel a half-century of conspiracy theories. She refused to allow an autopsy. Her stated reason was that he had suffered enough and she did not want his body to be further violated. But to a skeptical public and to later historians, her refusal seemed like a deliberate act of concealment. The rumors began almost immediately. The most sensational theory, popularized in a lurid 1930 book called The Strange Death of President Harding, was that the First Lady herself had poisoned her husband. The motive, it was argued, was one of mercy, to spare him the inevitable humiliation of impeachment and disgrace that the unfolding scandals would bring. Other theories claimed he was poisoned by the Ohio gang to ensure his silence, or that he had taken his own life. For decades, these dark speculations persisted, but modern medical analysis and historical scholarship have almost entirely dismissed them. The truth, historians now overwhelmingly agree, was far less sinister and far more tragic. Warren G. Harding was a man with a long history of heart disease. He was under an almost unimaginable level of personal and professional stress. The combination of his chronic cardiac condition, the physical exhaustion of his trip. Modern medical analysis has largely dismissed these dark speculations. Historians now overwhelmingly agree that Harding, a man with a long history of heart disease, died from a massive heart attack or stroke, fatally complicated by the immense physical and emotional stress of his final journey, and the crushing weight of his friends' betrayals. The news of President Harding's sudden death plunged the nation into a profound state of mourning. Vice President Calvin Coolidge was sworn in by his father in a simple candlelit ceremony in rural Vermont, and the presidency passed into his quiet, steady hands. But the country's attention was fixed on the long, slow journey of the funeral train that carried Harding's body from San Francisco back to Washington, D.C. The outpouring of public grief was staggering, unlike anything the nation had ever seen. Millions of Americans lined the railroad tracks in silent vigil as his funeral train crossed the country. They were farmers, factory workers, and families, standing in the summer heat for hours, holding flowers and flags. They lined the tracks to mourn the man they thought they knew, the kind, handsome, decent president who had promised them peace and normalcy. They were mourning a memory, an idea. They had no idea they were actually standing vigil over a tomb of secrets, waiting to be unearthed. After a grand state funeral in the Capitol Rotunda, Warren G. Harding was taken home one last time and buried in Marion, Ohio. Florence, who had guarded his legacy so fiercely, died just over a year later and was buried beside him in a grand marble tomb that would, for a time, stand as a monument to a beloved, tragically lost leader. After Harding's death, the curtain was pulled back. Congressional investigations exposed a deep network of corruption. Cabinet Secretary Albert Fall went to prison, a first in U.S. history. Others in his Ohio gang faced justice or disgrace. Harding's once golden reputation was destroyed, buried by scandals like Teapot Dome and personal revelations, including a secret child confirmed by DNA decades later. He was branded America's worst president. So, what is his final legacy? More recent history has taken a balanced view, acknowledging his real achievements, like preventing a naval arms race and creating the first federal budget. But these cannot erase the stain. So what is the final verdict on Warren G. Harding? He wasn't America's most evil president. He may have simply been its most fatally kind. A man whose greatest strength, his unwavering loyalty, became his country's greatest vulnerability. He craved friendship and in turn gave away the nation's trust. His story is not some dusty chapter in a history book. It is a timeless, brutal warning that in the lonely halls of power, the most dangerous enemies are not the ones who hate you. They are the ones you call your friends.